To make a soldered band ring, begin by sizing your finger on a ring sizer to know which size you would like to make your ring. For example, a size 7. Then refer to your ring size chart, and you can either measure it in inches or in millimeters. So a size 7, I'm going to look at 54 millimeters on my ruler. Cut your sheet of metal to the correct length that you will need. Take it then to a ring mandrel, and with a mallet, you will then hit it on the mandrel after you formed it with your fingers, and get the two ends of the ring to touch exactly. Before you solder, they must touch exactly. Think of solder as the glue for metal, like glue sticks or Elmer's glue or the glue for paper. So if the paper is not touching, it won't glue. So you have to make sure the two metal ends are touching exactly. If you can't get them to touch exactly on the mandrel with your mallet, you can take 2 pliers, and I tape the pliers with some masking tape to cushion it so the pliers won't scrape my metal, and you can move them together back and forth to get your ring ends to touch. Then you can take it to an anvil, and on the flat side of the anvil, using a mallet, hit that seam together and make it flat, so the ring almost looks like a D at this point. We can always reshape the ring after we solder it, but this ensures that our ends are put together nicely, they're touching, and the solder will be easier to flow through that seam. Then I get my third hand ready at my soldering station and hold the ring so the seam is down. Take some flux and paint it on the seam. Now, make sure you understand the difference in different solder grades, hard, medium, and easy. I'm going to use easy on this ring because easy is the lowest melting temperature for solder, and I only have one solder seam. If I had multiple solder seams, I would start using hard and work my way down to easy. So I fluxed the seam, and I'm taking a tweezers and picking up a small piece of easy solder and putting it on the back end of the seam. Solder flows towards the heat, so if I heat the front, the solder should flow towards me. If I need to add an extra bit of solder in the middle of the seam, if I have a long seam, I could do that. Now I'm building on the sweat soldering skills that my students learned, and I'm going to treat this almost like a sweat soldering project where I start far away with my torch to begin to heat the flux. If I'm too close, the air pressure from the torch will blow the piece of solder right off. So I'm starting far away with my torch and getting that flux to heat up. You can see the flux bubbling and it has turned white. And now I can get closer with my torch. Again, solder flows towards the heat. So if I heat the front and I put the solder in the back, the solder should flow towards my torch tip. And if I need to, I can take the poker and go in and sometimes just poke that solder and push it along that seam once we're at the correct melting temperature. So I'm heating it up and my solder is about to flow. You can see my torch is quite close now, and I'm taking that poker and moving it in and kind of guiding the solder. You can see the silver line of solder right now on the seam of the ring. I'm now going to quench the ring, and actually the whole third hand, right into the water so I don't burn myself. And I can see the solder has flowed down my seam. I'm going to put it in the pickle, and make sure to use copper tongs when you take it out of the pickle. Once I've gotten it out of the pickle, I'm going to reform it on the mandrel so it's a perfect circle. And I'm going to go to the flex shaft to sand. I'm taking 220 sandpaper, and I'm going to put it in the slotted mandrel on the flex shaft and sand the inside and the outside of my soldered band ring with 220 sandpaper. If I have a puddle of solder on the inside, the sandpaper starting at 220 will get rid of that puddle. I can practically make the seam invisible if I sand correctly. So I'm starting with 220 on the inside of my ring, making sure I have goggles and mask on and my vents are on. And I'm sanding the inside and the outside of my soldered band ring. Now I'm going to cut 600 sandpaper, about 1 inch wide, about 3 or 4 inches long, and put it in the slotted mandrel and begin my flex shaft again. 600 sandpaper will give it a more refined, finished look. If I still have a puddle on the inside, I should stick with 220 until that puddle is sanded away. But now I'm doing 600 on the inside and the outside, and you can already see it's getting a lot shinier looking. Sometimes I change the direction right on top of the seam, and then I go back to the other direction. That seam could become practically invisible if I sand it enough. And I'll notice with 600 sandpaper, it's getting pretty shiny. It's getting prepared to be polished. So there's my seam, very clean, inside and out. And now I'm going to take it to the polishing wheel. To polish a ring on the polishing wheel, I take a wooden finger, and I'm going to push the ring on as far as it can go and make sure to hold the thin end of the tapered finger so the ring doesn't fly off. I hold both ends, but definitely the thin end. I've got my goggles and mask, and I open the vent, and I'm polishing right on top of this ring on the wooden finger. So I don't have to hold it, it doesn't get hot, it's not going to fly away, and it's going to get really shiny.